Welcome to the Get Real Therapy podcast, where we educate and empower you with real therapeutic tools to help you improve your life. If you're listening to this podcast, consider this a sign that you're exactly where you're supposed to be. It's time to get real. Well, welcome everybody to the Get Real Therapy podcast. I'm Abby.
And I'm V.
And we're super excited that you're here.
Absolutely. So for you personally, what would you go ahead and say is your biggest inspiration?
My own mental health journey, for sure. I guess we can all say our mental health journey has really started since the day we were born, whether we realized it or not, right? But when I really became aware of the fact that I really needed to start working on my mental health was when I hit my version of rock bottom like 6 years ago. My rock bottom manifested as almost daily panic attacks, constant anxiety, a lot of insomnia, not wanting to go and do things by myself. My rock bottom was an accumulation of a lot of things, but what got me to go out and seek a therapist was the fact that I had a panic attack on an airplane, and it was so intense I walked off and didn't go on my flight. So once I saw that I couldn't even take a 2-hour flight home without panicking, I need to go ahead and see a therapist. You know, previously in my life, I had traveled, so it's not to say that, I've had this travel anxiety. It's just that all the other anxiety in my life ended up manifesting, and that moment was just stressful enough for a variety of reasons that the panic overtook me, and that really went to show me, okay, I'm really not managing my day-to-day life anymore if I can't even do this. How I found my therapist was a little unique. Heard an advertisement on the radio as I was in a Starbucks drive-thru. I feel like that was even more of a sign from God that I found this therapist as I was ordering coffee. And so,
because coffee's your favorite.
Yes, of course. And anyway, I got super blessed that the first therapist that I found was the therapist that I still have 6 years later, who helped me dramatically change my life. And I say that that's such a blessing because a lot of people don't have good experiences in therapy.
In fact, I think every single person that's hearing this could probably go ahead and say that therapy doesn't function, and they'd be right to go ahead and say it. There's a lot of different therapeutic techniques that exist out there, and I find it so shocking, especially because I've always had the impression that psychology as a whole was something that was fairly well understood, but it wasn't until you started to go in your therapeutic journey, not just in your own personal life, but in your own aspirations as becoming a mental health counselor, we started to go ahead and see that that's not the case. That there's these techniques that isn't the norm.
Yeah, it's not what most therapists are taught in school. Part of my mental health journey is me becoming a mental health counselor and finishing up. This is my last year of grad school, getting my master's in clinical mental health counseling. And part of the inspiration for why I went back to school to get this master's was because of the power and the freedom that I found from going to therapy. The thing is, most people, when they enter into careers, right, you have this idealistic view of what that career is going to be. I'm sure you thought the same thing becoming a dentist, right? That people are going to look up to me and it's going to be so prestigious in a way. You obviously learn there's maybe elements of that along the road, but that's not how it is day in and day out when you have the real reality of it. So when I had the real experience of going to therapy, that's what really inspired me to go back to school and actually pursue that. And then it was through actual transformation that happened in my own life that I was okay, I've always been interested in this, but now I really understand how powerful it can really be. And if it was able to transform, like I said, having almost daily panic attacks, extreme anxiety, I want to be in the business of helping people find the freedom that I got.
Yeah. And I think that is very in line in terms of why I decided to go ahead and do this. I see that there's such a drastic need. The need to go ahead and understand these concepts doesn't necessarily just apply to practitioners. You could go ahead and see that this could affect all my patients as it affects me personally. I could see it being an incredible useful tool for practitioners though. And it's just something that's needed for the world. If this isn't done, I know we as human beings will destroy ourselves. Okay. And this is essentially one way in terms of how we could go ahead and see how we could help each other. It allows us to become awakened. And if we are able to go ahead and learn these therapeutic techniques that we're going to go ahead and talk about in this podcast, I could promise anybody listening that if they actually do the work, that it will lead to the most successful life that's absolutely possible.
The main model of therapy that we're going to discuss on this podcast, it's really like a blueprint for your own life, is internal family systems.
Yes. So internal family systems is a fantastic model to go ahead and learn, because you could immediately start applying it into your own life. In fact, after this episode, you'll be able to go ahead and start using it, at least start being able to change your view of the world and seeing how it could easily be seen in external individuals. I think that the trick is how to employ those methodologies of using internal family systems within yourself without any guidance from an external source.
Yeah, because usually those parts of us that you'll learn about through the model of IFS are very resistant to changing the way that they've been operating in your life.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about what is internal family systems then.
Mm-hmm. This was developed by Dr. Richard Schwartz 40 years ago. He is a psychologist, and where he really developed it was from his time working as a family therapist. And so family therapy views the client as the entire family. So even though there might be one person that's the identified client that brings the family to therapy, it's the entire family that the clinician is treating. That being said, family therapy is considered a systems theory, and systems theory basically posits that we all exist within communities in our life. We exist within different systems. We exist within the family unit. We exist within our society, within our culture, and all of these interact with one another, and they interact with the individual. Not only did he start to develop this theory from working with families, but he started to develop this theory from working with people who had eating disorders. And so the people with eating disorders that he treated, they would say things to the effect of, when I feel really shamed or like overwhelmed, we'll go ahead and binge. And then there's a part of me that feels really guilty and crappy that I binged. And so now I want to purge. And it's this internal conflict back and forth that the client is stuck in. And so when he started to see these same kind of main players showing up in the description of these clients' internal world, he was able to combine that with his systems thinking, and he developed IFS. So IFS,
which is internal family
yes,
system.
We all have sub-personalities in our mind, and they're what really make up our entire personality. And so these different parts of ourselves can go ahead and be at war with one another. You know, you probably can think of a time where a part of me wants to go out on Friday night, and a part of me also wants to stay home. So it's already in our everyday language that without even realizing it, we are expressing that we have these different like parts of ourselves, and they have their own feelings, they have their own desires, and they have their own beliefs.
Dr. Richard Schwartz started to essentially just give definitions to what these parts are. So in internal family systems, the system that he developed is through observation of what the patients were telling him. So yes, he developed the theory, but he developed the theory because he just started to notice this within every single individual. So even though, Dr. Richard Schwartz invented this, in reality, it's inside all of us. He's just explaining through observation of how he was able to go ahead and identify which parts were functional, which parts were not functional, and just understanding the mind is fractured into several different personalities. And the question isn't necessarily, should my mind be fractured? It should, okay? But is it functional or not? That's it. So you have all these parts within you, and these parts could either be functional or non-functional. And the ultimate decision-making process of if they are functional or not is, are you getting the result that you want? And I think that that's a great way to go ahead and think about it, because it destigmatizes a lot of these symptoms that a malfunctioning part could go ahead and portray in the individual. If this part isn't necessarily producing the result that you want, let's say you have a part that's making you depressed. Well, before I used to go ahead and think depression was a quality of a person. And then after understanding internal family systems, I could go ahead and think, no, your depression is just a part. And now I see that depression is a part trying to keep you safe. And you could go ahead and see that if you have a depressed individual, well, that part is just telling you the world is too dangerous. Let's stay inside.
Yeah, and I want to add to that could be one person's depressed part, right?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
But
yeah.
it could also be manifesting because of the years and years that they suppress their own feelings.
That's
Yeah.
absolutely, you're right. It is just an example. Like, what I'm trying to say is that it changes the perspective of these previous diagnoses that I thought were, I guess, concrete.
For
So
sure.
before, for example, ADHD, OCD, depression, all these things I used to think were just concrete examples, things that should be managed with medicine. And then now I'm starting to go ahead and see that they're not things that should be managed with medicine, but things that can be fixed.
Well, not that they shouldn't be managed with medicine, but that there's a greater potential for them to not have to be managed with medicine.
Exactly. And mind you, that's going to be left to the practitioner. I do think that by understanding this principle, I think that a lot of practitioners are going to rely a lot less on medicine. And I could see that being a potential problem because obviously pharmaceutical companies aren't going to necessarily love that. And the thing is that it's not to go ahead and say that they're inherently evil. It's just to go ahead and say it as in general, we're all unhealthy. But there is a shining light at the end of the tunnel, and that's internal family systems.
So the model is simple. Now, there's a lot of neuroscience and neurobiology that backs up all of it. It is an evidence-based model of psychotherapy. So I am so excited in the future to be able to really get into the neuroscience and the biology behind it, because when I've been a client going to therapy for the first time, what gave me the most hope was understanding the science behind everything that my therapist was using with me. In the theory of IFS, you have all these different parts, and a lot of these parts, they can be in conflict with one another. And so these parts go into categories, which makes it super easy for anybody to go ahead and learn and start mapping out their own internal world. Like a part taking over would be somebody gets triggered by something and now they're reacting. They're angry,
Exactly.
they're crying, whatever.
And you could see that because you're talking to somebody and then all of a sudden their personality changes. So like if you're interacting with somebody and they feel like they're in their true self, and you could sense that. It's essentially when I see somebody in their true self, they're just authentic. You know, that's authentically who they are. And let's go ahead and define what the true self is. The true self is having the ability to feel compassion, being creative, being curious, being connected, courageous, confidence, having clarity, and being calm. If you possess those qualities, you're in your true self.
So the goal of IFS is to get the client to go ahead and be self-led as much as possible in their life. Self-led means the true self is what's really leading the show in your life. In IFS, you have all these different parts. Some of them are protective parts. And so that's literally what it's called in the theory, protector parts. And they come in the form of managers or firefighters. So you can think of managers as being proactive in your life and firefighters as being reactive. And so with firefighters, you can literally take the name as it is. They're trying to put out the emotional fire in your life. You're triggered and now your firefighter comes out to manage that emotional pain that has been activated inside of you. While managers, these are trying to prevent these emotions and prevent the pain from arising in the first place. So you can think as a manager as this part of you that kind of runs your day-to-day life. They are the people, the parts of us that present most in our life in your day-to-day interactions with the people in your life. Something so important to note in this theory is that there's no bad parts. Even if the parts are extremely destructive, let's just say addiction, right? These parts all have positive intentions for your overall system, your overall person. The goal of IFS would be to get the client to be able to unblend from these parts so that they can gain more access to their true self.
These protectors that you're talking about, they're trying to go ahead and protect what?
So these protective parts had to develop for a reason. And so they developed to protect these younger, vulnerable, wounded parts of ourselves. These parts of you that got frozen in time from these different experiences that you've had in your life, little T traumas and big T traumas. The whole purpose of the theory is to get these exiled, more vulnerable parts free from the past.
So they're called exiles.
Yes, they're called exiles. So you exile them away. So it's like, I'm in the 6th grade, I have a crush on a boy, and I write him a note that I think he's cute, and he shows the note to his friends, and I'm rejected. I'm so mortified, I feel ashamed, and I'm never gonna go ahead and remember this moment again. I exile that part of me away, the part of me that went ahead and told this guy my feelings. This is just an example. And now I develop a protective part that's like, we never want to feel that embarrassment and that rejection again. So now we're just not going to share how we feel with people. Now, maybe to some people listening, you're thinking like, oh, that wasn't that big of a deal. But for some people who've already had other negative experiences in their life where they've been rejected, maybe they have a parent that's highly critical of them. Maybe they belong to a religious community that has a lot of strict rules. They already have this predisposition to being more sensitive to that rejection. So now this is just like icing on the cake for them. They develop this part that just is very shut off, very closed down, doesn't want to share its feelings, right? And so that part that doesn't want to share its feelings is the protective part. It's the proactive manager that says, we're just not going to share our feelings because I don't want to get triggered again and have this emotional pain from the past pop up. This experience, you exile it away in your mind. This protective part, this defensive mechanism shows up in your life now in this form. So the most important part of the theory is that we all have this true self, and it's self with a capital S. And self with a capital S is innate. It's who you are when you were born, and it's there. It's just that through these life experiences that we have, through conditioning, through society, through little t traumas, big T traumas, we start losing access to self. The goal of us is to bring these exiled parts into the present moment and integrate them so that you can go ahead and fully heal.
Internal family systems just basically makes it so that you can understand who's driving the car. The best way to go ahead and think about it is when you are feeling at your best, and that's your true self. So when is it that you feel your best? For me, it's when I travel. Every time I travel, I feel that I'm present in the moment. I feel all the characteristics of the true self. And that's what I love about internal family systems. It makes sense. You'll listen to these things and you'll be able to easily identify it, like you said, when that has been applicable in your own life. You know, like I have a part of me that, you know, like wants to go traveling, and a part of me that gets a little bit upset when I can't, you know, or I have a part of me that wants to go work out, and then I have another part of me that says I'm a little too tired, you know, or even for my own patients, they know that they need to go ahead and take care of their teeth, and they have a part of them that doesn't want them to go ahead and take care of their teeth. So if we understand that, you know, the true self is who you really are, and the true self has these characteristics. Let's say you're in an argument and you have the inability to show compassion towards the person that you're having an argument with. Well, because you have that inability to show compassion, that means that you are in a part. So the goal is to be in your true self so you are able to show compassion. Where does the true self reside? The true self resides in the prefrontal cortex, you know, and the prefrontal cortex is responsible for understanding how your thoughts, actions, and behaviors affect you in the long term. Every single aspect of your life is controlled by a part. And the only question is that part doing its function correctly, or is it doing it incorrectly? So the true self is supposed to go ahead, and the true self is essentially your consciousness, your ability to go ahead and say, I am here and present. And again, it's characterized by being compassionate, creative, curious, connected, courageous, confidence, clarity, and calm. And sometimes we have to use these parts in conjunction with the true self to ride a bicycle, to drive a car, to do a bunch of other things. And then these parts are, and sometimes they're malfunctioning. So to give a really good example, for me, you know, like I had the inability to go ahead and speak to people. I realized I had this problem because I gave a presentation and I felt like I was choking up. The part that was choking me is the firefighter. So the firefighter is a part that's very reactive. It sees that I'm bad at speaking to people. So it keeps telling me, you're bad at speaking to people. I'm going to go ahead and choke you. I'm going to go ahead and, you know, not cause your mind to be clear. So I lost clarity because of that, because it's trying to protect me. It's trying to help me, but it's doing so in the wrong way. I have this firefighter every single time I go ahead and speak that causes the presentation to go astray. And I thought to myself, I need to go ahead and fix this. So what do? I, in my true self, I'm sitting down. I remember this perfectly too. I'm sitting down in a sofa and I realized I need to go ahead and make sure that this never happens to me again. And I focus on that sensation. I focus on the sensation as the firefighter trying to help me. And because the firefighter's trying to go ahead and help me by choking me out, what I'm inadvertently doing is I'm opening up those neuronal networks to pinpoint the original traumatic event that led to this firefighter to even be born. So the original traumatic event is the exile, the trauma that initiated this firefighter to have this new function. I thought to myself, well, when was the first time I actually felt this? And I went back in time, essentially. I gave this presentation, like I think in 2020, I did terribly. And I thought to myself, well, I've had this in dental school. I've had this in university. I had this in high school, all the way back to elementary school. And I remember that in elementary school, in the 3rd and 4th grade, somewhere between those, the 3rd and 4th grade, before the 3rd grade, I never had this issue. And then after, I always had that issue. So I knew something happened between the 3rd and 4th grade that had to be dealt with. It's something that I never would have thought of, but all of a sudden, because I was thinking about, sensation of being choked, this memory came about, and it was this memory of being taken out of my classroom, and I was placed in a different classroom with a bunch of other kids who either had learning disabilities or had problems speaking out. So it was like a whole group of kids, and they were all trying to go ahead and teach them to behave. This shows how important it is to understand that not everything that happens to you is intentionally done with malice. There's a lot of things that you could go ahead and see that their intention was to go ahead and help me and help the teacher and help my other classmates so that everybody could go ahead and learn. But the problem is this: my mind was immature to understand what their true message was. The true message is to not speak when the teacher's speaking, to learn to go ahead and know when is the appropriate time to go ahead and talk. But what happened? My immature mind understood, just don't talk. So that's the exile. The exile is I got shamed. Every single time I wanted to go ahead and speak, a teacher would be like, no, remember, you can't talk. So then I just learned I can't talk. So I developed a firefighter part that basically started to go ahead and continuously say the same message that those teachers were saying, which is you can't talk. What ended up happening is now every single time I try to speak, this firefighter would go
in
ahead.
a group, or can you specify like what is like?
Well, that's the problem. The problem is that what's supposed to happen to make this a functional part, right? What's supposed to happen is my mind was supposed to be mature enough to understand that they were specifically talking about in a very specific situation, which is just in the classroom. But my mind basically said, you can't speak. It was very difficult to go ahead and speak in a group. And then it just got worse and worse and worse that I couldn't even hold a conversation with a regular person, So even one-on-one, I would feel this
like social anxiety?
Exactly, social anxiety, absolutely. And for the longest time, I thought that was just a characteristic, an innate characteristic of who I am as a person, until I did this therapy. And then all of a sudden I realized, holy crap, something that I thought was who I am as a person just disappeared. It took 5 minutes to do it. Once I found out what the exile was, I was able to go ahead and see that this exile had the wrong notion of what it was supposed to be taught. So you're supposed to just explain it to that young version of yourself. What they actually meant is you're supposed to go ahead, mind you, in this situation, I'm pretending that I'm speaking to this younger version of myself.
You're like visualizing it in your mind.
Yes. I visualized this younger version of myself.
So you saw what you looked like when you were in the 3rd or 4th grade.
Absolutely. I envisioned a younger version of myself in the 3rd or 4th grade. So this 10-year-old boy sitting in a classroom, I look at his face. I see that there's anxiety in his face just from being there. And then me, as who I am right now, goes up to this kid and I tell this kid, listen, the things that they were teaching you, they were trying to go ahead and teach when is the appropriate time to go ahead and speak. I want you to come with me. And what I'm doing when I say I want you to come with me is I'm taking it from the past and I'm bringing it to the present moment. And I'm showing it. I want you to come with me to see how I speak to my friends. I want you to see how I speak to my patients. I want you to see that speaking is an excellent thing, and you don't necessarily have to be afraid to do this. So once I envisioned this younger version of myself being in that classroom and being absolutely fine, then I knew that I unburdened this exile. And because
from the belief that like nobody wants to hear me speak, it's wrong if I speak, whatever.
Exactly. More like it's wrong if I speak.
Okay.
Yeah. So now that this exile has become unburdened, I feel absolutely like this tremendous relief, and I know that it worked because I always thought I had a difficulty in crying, but I could feel myself getting teary-eyed. So I knew that something was happening. Now, mind you, this is like the first time I ever tried doing this. So and this is me in the couch by myself. So it's not something I particularly knew if I was doing it right or wrong. I just knew the theory, and I was just doing the theory, like I said, by myself. And I felt like, oh my goodness, like I could feel this unburdening actually happening. It feels like all of a sudden something I've always known is, and at the same time never been known. It's just all happening at the same time. So now that this exile has been unburdened, and again, the only way I knew it was unburdened is because I imagined that younger version of myself in the classroom, and now I actually picture it being happy. Like, and this is naturally, I'm not forcing this younger version to try to be happy. It's just, I just see it and I see a happy face. So now that it's unburdened, well, guess what? The protectors don't need to protect something that was burdened before by this previous belief. Now they have the ability, this firefighter has the ability to go ahead and say, now that I don't have to protect this exile, I could do something new. So then I spoke to the firefighter, and I remember speaking to the firefighter saying, listen, I know that your job was to go ahead and shut me up, but instead of shutting me up, why don't you go ahead and give me some energy to go ahead and pay attention to, the crowd, or to go ahead and give me some energy so I could go ahead and try to remember these things that are like deep inside my mind. Essentially using this firefighter for something that's going to be helpful for my true self instead of hurting me in the long run. The problem is that because the firefighter, wherever it resides in this specific situation, it's not in the prefrontal cortex. It has no concept if what it's doing is helpful or not. The easiest way I like to think about what these parts are is I like to go ahead and think about, like, I don't know if you've ever seen these like old TV shows where somebody's making a phone call and they call a switchboard operator, and that switchboard operator has to go ahead and physically disconnect a plug to plug into the phone number that you're trying to go ahead and call. And then every single time you call, it's going to be to that number now. And if you want to call a new number, you have to call the switchboard operator to be like, no, I want to call this number. And then somebody has to manually connect it to a different one. To me, that's how parts work. So you have to physically pick what you want the function to be. Once you manually switch what you want that function to be, it's going to be that function from now on. But it has to be a conscious decision. Otherwise, unconsciously, you're always going to go ahead and do the same thing if you like it or not.
Yeah, and I think to really explain the science behind this, you having that envisioning of being able to go ahead and reprocess that moment in your life when you're 10 years old and you're feeling this shame and you're feeling just down that, you're bad for talking, right? And it's bad to go ahead and talk. When your brain sees that image in your mind's eye, you're really connecting with the limbic system part of your brain, which is the emotional processing part of your brain. And when your brain sees an image, the emotional side of your brain, specifically your amygdala, cannot tell if that image in your mind is real or fake. So by you going back in your mind and envisioning the person you are now going to that younger part of you, that emotional part of your brain is literally thinking that that's the reality that's happening. And so that's where neuroplasticity comes in. And the more you can go ahead and really visualize for a minimum of 20 seconds, that corrective experience of you going back to that part of you and giving it what it needed in that moment, those neuroplastic changes is what causes that switching of that neuronal network to be more automatic in the future, to where you're not like getting triggered in the same way that you were before. So like this whole theory, while it can sound, abstract or weird, whatever, it's completely based on science and how the brain works.
So we spoke about what the exile is. We spoke about what the true self is. We spoke about what the firefighter is in that example. But I knew that there was another part. I knew that there was a manager. And this is the part that blew my mind. This is something I never once thought about. I asked myself, well, in this situation of, giving this bad presentation and having incredible fear for speaking socially, what's the manager? Where is it in this situation? Well, the manager is proactive. I asked myself, what is the proactive manager in this situation? And all of a sudden, like a lightning bolt, it just hit that I remembered every single time I would work on a presentation, I would have this voice in my head that would say, oh, you're bad at giving presentations, so don't work on that presentation. Let's go ahead and do something else. As strange as it sounds, even though I'm saying that there's this voice in my head, at the same time, I'd never heard it. Mm-hmm. Okay, it was something that was happening unconsciously. So what would happen is every time I try to go ahead and focus on working on a presentation, I'd end up doing something else.
You get distracted.
I get distracted. And
lose focus.
And it used to drive me insane. It used to, because the thing is that me as my true self, actually wants to go ahead and work on this. And then all of a sudden, I'm watching TV, or I just lost an incredible amount of time, and I realized that's the manager. The manager is proactively trying to go ahead and stop me from getting into a situation where I would be publicly speaking. And then when I am publicly speaking, I would have a firefighter that would try to shut me up. Okay. And both of those managers and the firefighter are trying to protect the exile, which is the younger version of myself that got shamed into thinking that speaking in a group of people was a bad thing. And again, the most important thing to understand about all this is none of this was done with the concept of trying to hurt me.
As a child, it still really, really hurts.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I didn't even realize hurt. You know, I didn't realize that that affected me. I just thought that that's who I was until I actually went back in time and I saw, oh crap, you know what? Before the third grade, I never felt that way.
Yeah, you were able to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, that's the reason they even put me in that class, because I spoke too much, you know? So I know for a fact that I had more self-like characteristics the younger I was.
Yeah, you had that confidence to speak. You had that creativity.
That's true for any child too. You see any child, the second it's born to whatever age, you're more in self just naturally, which is something I love about this theory, because it's not something that you acquired. Let's go ahead and talk about, you know, a couple of ways that someone could go ahead and start employing internal family systems in their lives right now. I think that the easiest way that they could start employing the system is just by changing the vocabulary in which they go ahead and speak. One of the easiest ways that I love doing this is starting to go ahead and speak like, I have a part of me that feels this way, instead of saying, I feel this way.
Or I feel this way.
Yeah, exactly.
A part of me feels this way.
Absolutely. And I think that is able to go ahead and create some separateness from this feeling that, you know, most likely is a bad feeling, so that you can go ahead and say that that's not inherently who I am. And that's a great thing, because now you could go ahead and do it in reverse as well. You know, like you can imagine that you're having an argument with somebody, and now you could go ahead and say that that person, if they're treating you poorly, you could say that they just have a part of them that is behaving in a way that's not appropriate, and that's not inherently who they are. I think a wonderful way that can be started to go ahead and immediately start being employed. And the reason why it's important to go ahead and do that is because every single relationship, the relationship with your family, with your significant other, or even just with your coworkers, if you go ahead and see that they have the potential of being in their true self, which again, their true self is an innate part of who they are, as in it really is who it is. I think that's important to understand, because if you go ahead and you see that everybody has the capability of having compassion, if you see that everybody has the capability of having creativity, curiosity, being connected, being courageous, having clarity, being calm, being confident, and that's who everyone is naturally, then you know that when they're not being that way, that's just a part of them. And that's not who they truly are. It's just a malfunctioning part. And that's fantastic. The idea that comes to mind perfectly is, do you remember one of the first times you got a bad phone call in the dental office, and then it upset you? And I remember that, you know, I started to go ahead and cry. And then literally a couple of weeks later, this lady that's 98 years old comes to the office, and she, you know, gets seen by me, and then we present her a treatment plan, and then she crumpled up the treatment plan and threw it at your face. And then she called you the devil, I think.
Yeah, she did.
Exactly. And then I asked you, because I was so surprised, I was like, oh my God, if you got so upset for a phone call, how come you didn't show any kind of negative reaction towards someone physically assaulting you, even though it was a piece of paper, but it was physical assault nonetheless, and a lot more aggressive than a phone call when they called you the devil and they storm out. And then you said, well, that poor lady, she could have Alzheimer's. I don't know what's wrong with her. And I remember saying, this is even before we even understood that therapy, I remembered saying to you that, isn't that the same case with everybody else? Isn't that what happened with that phone call too? Just because that person treated you poorly doesn't mean that that's who they really are.
Oh, you know? For sure. I remember a part of me could not accept that though at that time. And I think it's because like it was just easier to have compassion for a lady who was so much older and who didn't seem like mentally well.
Absolutely.
Where whoever that was on the phone, I know was like somebody who was younger, maybe just like middle-aged or whatever. And it's kind of like, okay, you don't have cognitive decline to blame on like you freaking out for really no reason. But of course, looking back like in hindsight, it's okay, this part of that person was triggered in situation and just like taking it out on me, you know?
Yeah, now it's easier to go ahead and see that. In both cases, it was just parts of those people. Like no matter what, even the most vile person in the world, they have the potential to exhibit characteristics of the self if they were given the right tools.
Yeah,
So
and
it
there's a
shows-
chance they may not, but like that's not for us to decide.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's obviously some mental disorders which the entire concept honestly should be reevaluated. Once you understand this concept, this entire that DSM, right, which stands for
Yeah, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders.
Exactly. And it's this gigantic book that has all these disorders. And all of this is exactly what the real issue is. Before understanding internal family systems, you used to go ahead and see those, diagnoses. I used to go ahead and think that that's it. You know, that's who the person is. They were born that way. It's a chemical imbalance. And the only way to manage them is through some kind of medicine. You know,
Yeah, and I
or-
would like the fact that you mentioned that chemical imbalance really just shared that they recently did this meta-analysis where a meta-analysis basically when they take previously published work from different journals, so like let's say medical journals, psychological journals, right? So in the psychology and the medical community, there was this meta-analysis that took all these different published studies under review that were specifically focusing on that belief that depression is caused by lack of serotonin or low serotonin in the brain. And it shows that like that theory is completely a myth. Like there's no evidence that shows, oh, low serotonin is why you're depressed.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean that SSRIs, which are like go-to like antidepressant like medications, that they don't work. It's just that we can't say that they work because of serotonin. They are working for some reason, whether it's just the placebo effect, whether there's something else that it's doing in the brain, who knows? But the reality is that depression has nothing to do with not having enough serotonin.
Exactly.
And like that's just amazing. And I feel like it's so important to note because even that's something that people have like believed in for years and years and years of their life, right? But to really understand that like it's not true, it's when you keep saying like everything has to be reevaluated, right? It absolutely does because there is like an influx of new information. And that's something so important to understand that like you have to be open to the fact that like your beliefs may not actually be fact.
And everything has to be reevaluated because there's this exponential growth in terms of the research that's being done and not just necessary psychology. For example, if we just look at dentistry, like when I started doing dentistry, which isn't that long ago, like it's like, what, 11, 12 years ago, even up to very currently, I was taking physical impressions. You know, I tried using those digital scanners and I wasn't necessarily happy with the success rate with them. And then only recently, I found this great scanner that allowed me to go ahead and just work in a way that I've always wanted to go ahead and work. And this is brand new. You know, imagine if I said, oh, scanners, I never want to go ahead and use them. I would not make it. Okay. I'd always be doing these physical impressions and mind you, like when I do physical impressions, no matter how perfect you do it, there's always adjustments you have to go ahead and do. And I hated that. I hated not being able to go ahead and get the perfection that I desired because I give the laboratory perfection. I expect perfection back. So when I don't get perfection back, and I'm not necessarily blaming the laboratory, I understand that it has to do with the distortion from the stone, the distortion from the impression material, the distortion from whatever methodologies that they go ahead and use to fabricate whatever appliance that I asked them to fabricate. So at each step, there's a potential for error. And now there's this new technology that I could have easily dismissed it. I could have easily said, I don't want to do it. And that I could have just continued to suffer. And that's just in one tiny aspect of my life. So by understanding that there's this exponential growth of information, you could see that there's going to be these new tools that are going to be completely available to every single human being in terms of understanding how the mind works and in terms of understanding how to master it. And this is it. I really truly believe that every single individual in history understood this same concept, but they understood it through either luck or they understood it through living a horrific life.
Yeah, intense suffering.
Exactly. That led them to understand it in the most difficult of ways. But now it's simple. It's being given to us in a step-by-step basis that you can go ahead and do, and hopefully you could do it by yourself, but most likely you're going to need the help of an individual. And that's exactly why we created Get Real Therapy. We created Get Real Therapy to essentially turn therapy upside down. What we're trying to do with Get Real Therapy is we're trying to go ahead and even change the notion of what the word therapy even means. Before, if I asked you, what is a therapist or what is therapy, you'd imagine that there's somebody that needs help, and you'd imagine that there's a therapist that is going to go ahead and fix that person. We're changing that. We're changing it because that person, the therapist, is not the individual that's helping them, but it's the individual that needs the help. That's the only person, as in you yourself.
Yeah.
You are your own therapist.
Yeah.
And the goal of the quote-unquote therapist is just to show you how to do it. It's more of
be
a guide.
Yeah.
Exactly.
As well as not just like a guide, but for some people, and I totally fell into this category, you needed to have that experience of somebody that you could have a positive attachment to through the therapeutic relationship. I needed somebody to show me what self even was, because I was so blended with all my parts from trauma that being able to access this calm presence within myself that was confident and courageous, like I didn't believe that existed, you know?
And you said one important word too. You used the word blended. We never discussed what the word blended means. Blended just is you have an inability to understand that you're being taken over by a part. You think that the part is who you are. And in reality, no. Again, if you don't exhibit compassion, if you don't exhibit creativity, if you don't exhibit curiosity, connectedness, courage, clarity, calm, and confidence, then you are in a part. And if you don't have the ability to understand that you're in a part, that means you're blended. And when you're blended, that means that you're not going to be able to go ahead and understand how your thoughts, actions, and behavior affect you in the long term. I'm sure everybody has experienced this. You've probably been in an argument with somebody and you say something you regret and you're like, oh crap, why did I do that? Or you do something you regret and you're like, crap, why did I do that? And then that's because you're in a part and you're blended. I've met so many individuals, and I was one myself. I've met so many individuals that are so blended with their parts that the concept of thinking that there's this other true self is foreign to them. One of the things that I like to do to try to introduce them to their true self, because that's what you have to do. You have to introduce them to the possibility that there's a greater you. Go ahead and ask them, okay, when was it that you had a feeling of being in your true self? I've said it before that to me, it's traveling, right? But to some other people, it could be like when they were doing really great in a particular sport, or it could just be fractions of what the true self is at individual moments. Like, for example, when did you feel compassion? When was one time in your life that you actually felt compassion towards another human being? And compassion is different from empathy, right?
Empathy would just really be thinking about how if you were in this other person's shoes and really feeling with the person, but there's no action behind that feeling.
Okay,
where
absolutely.
like compassion is empathy plus action.
Exactly.
And appropriate action when you're really in your true self.
Absolutely.
That's the thing that I think a lot of people may get confused by. They might be like, oh yeah, I feel compassion towards people in my life. Oh yeah. But it's not the same thing, because something that we're definitely going to have to dive into on this podcast is what's known as self-like parts. And self-like parts are something that I have a lot of experience with, because I've had to deal with a lot of parts of myself that were self. So you could ask me like, oh, do you feel like, that you're a compassionate person? I would say absolutely, like, yes. I love helping people in my life. I love doing things for my friends and family, I'm more go with the flow. And so you could say, oh yeah, I'm compassionate, right? But what is really underneath that compassion? Now, it's not to say that at all times it's a self-like part showing up, but people who are like chronic people pleasers, they seem very compassionate, but there's this wound underneath that's driving that people-pleasing behavior that can come off as compassion, but it's really damaging to the individual.
Absolutely. One of the things that I like doing, like I said, is I like to go ahead for somebody that struggles understanding what the true self is. If they can't necessarily think of a specific time, I usually go with traveling, or I usually ask them to think of a moment where they saw something so beautiful and it left them in awe. Or I like to go ahead and again, like split up what the characteristics of self is. And I asked them, well, when was a time that you felt curious? Or when was a time that you felt courageous? Or when was a time you felt clarity? Or when was a time you felt creative? You know, and you could go ahead and do this yourself. And I think it's really important that everybody listening to this or seeing us does this themselves to define what the true self is. So hopefully you are able to go ahead and think of a specific moment where you felt all those things. Again, traveling is one of the ways I personally do it. And, you know, you feel fantastic, you know, and I remember speaking to somebody and they told me that, oh yeah, you feel great when you're on a vacation, but, you know, when you come back, you really want to feel that way too. And I'm like, of course I want to feel that way. Why wouldn't you want to go ahead and feel that fantastic all the time? Why are you going to go ahead and leave that great feeling for only 2 weeks out of the year of your life? No, I'm not going to go ahead and do that. I want to go ahead and feel fantastic as much as, you know, and then it's coming to the realization that when you don't feel that way, you're in a part, and now you could go ahead and have the tools to see if you can make those parts more, you know, and that makes it so that you have the power. I want the ability to be 100% in control of my life, because when people say, oh yeah, it's genetics, really, if you say it's genetics, guess what? You can't change that. But if you have the ability to go ahead and have the tools to change those malfunctioning parts to functional, well, you could go ahead and just continuously improve yourself to the point where you could feel like you're on vacation every single day of your life. And that's the way it should be. That's what I really believe that heaven on earth is.
Something that we're also trying to do with Get Real Therapy is to create a community where people can get real. We live in this society that is fake. I mean, look at, like, you know, Instagram, TikTok, social media, everything is so freaking fake, you know?
Yeah. And how AI is making it easier to turn everything fake.
Those pictures of famous people and situations and settings that are not real, but that look so freaking real.
Absolutely. What people are doing now is they're projecting this false sense of reality. And that's what parts are. You know, parts are just a false sense of reality. There's a part of you that has some kind of inferiority in terms of, like, feeling inferior in terms of where you are in life, and it overcompensates by showing this behavior of, oh my God, I have more money than I really do. Or even just the idea of having money or anything that's external be placed as something that's important, because in reality, when you are in your true self, you realize that all these external things are not what make you happy. Happiness comes from inside. When you go ahead and you place any kind of importance on something that's external, well, guess what? I could take those things away from you. That means that I have the ability to get rid of your happiness because it is external to your being.
Yeah, and those things own you.
Exactly. But if happiness comes from within, there's no one that could touch that. You know.
And I feel that's a phrase that a lot of people say. And I think that in the same way that a lot of other things are talked about, oh, keep gratitude journals and do breath work. It's so, like, I guess, pop culture psychology type of ways of thinking. But there is 100% science behind all of it. But the thing is that doing it correctly, and most people, again, it's just the way things a lot of times are presented is fake, right? Like, oh, you're going to start keeping a gratitude journal and tomorrow you're going to be so much happier. No, like, it takes time of training your brain to focus on the positive, because we're all prone to the negativity bias. It's a phenomenon where we first think of, like, the negative, but that's our survival as a species, right? Like, we have to be thinking more negatively about things. Otherwise, we would have never survived in the human race. But now, in our day-to-day life, like, that is obviously super detrimental to our overall well-being.
That's exactly what we're going to do in Get Real Therapy. In Get Real Therapy, we're going to go ahead and show you not only how to use internal family systems, we're going to talk about other therapeutic techniques like breathing, like gratitude journals, to even different kind of therapies that work in conjunction with internal family systems that are incredibly helpful in understanding how the mind works. And we want to give these tools and make it available to every human being. I really do believe that if we do this, we're going to change the community in ways that can't be comprehended. And you could easily see this. Like, you could easily see this because when you change just a tiny aspect of the community, it's left a dent in history. Like, they literally call it the summer of love, you know. And what did people do? People took acid, you know, like 60s. And what happened? When you take acid, it's a way of experience what your true self could possibly be. You know, it opened up the possibility. And why? Because what acid is able to go ahead, and a lot of psychedelics, what they're able to do is they're able to go ahead and cause the neurons in your mind to start to randomly fire. And the reason that's important is because an individual that hasn't taken any kind of psychedelics is essentially wired in a very specific way. And obviously, if that way that they're wired is malfunctional, then they're going to continue behaving in that malfunctional way. But when you go ahead and you take a psychedelic and now your wiring is being jumbled, well, you have a ability to go ahead and change.
Well, and tap into new ways of thinking that
yeah.
you couldn't access before.
Absolutely. Even though it's temporary, it was still able to go ahead and leave an imprint in history that they actually had to call it the Summer of Love.
Well, we want to thank everybody for listening or watching our first episode of Get Real Therapy. We're excited to continue and just bring you into this community that we hope will elevate you, inspire you, and ultimately help you realize that the capacity to heal is within you and is absolutely possible.
Yes. And we hope that you go ahead and you share this message with as many people as possible to have as many individuals understand and have the tools to free themselves from their own minds.